All right, guys, let's jump into some ecology. So this is the introduction to ecology. So this is going to cover quite a few concepts that we'll see in a little more detail in the other videos. So let's just jump right in. So some questions we want to be able to answer. Number one, what is ecology? We want to be able to define what's called ecological succession and the two kinds of ecological succession. And we want to talk a little bit about biomes. Now, hopefully some of this stuff is review from, life science in middle school and things that you already know. So I don't think it'll be too tremendously difficult. So what is ecology? Ecology is just the study of the interactions that living things undergo with other living things and non-living things in their environment. So it studies biomes, it studies food webs, it studies all the different behaviors on how organisms interact. It might be organisms interacting with other members of the same species. It may be organisms with predator-prey relationships, which we see in food webs. And it could also be how human beings interact with organisms or the environment. Now, we break up ecology into kind of focused levels. So we might look at just one species, which obviously would be a very narrow focus. We could look at a population, which is all of the species in a broad geographic area. We could look at a community, which would be all of the species in that big area. So like a population is just all of the orangutans in, this rainforest. A community would be all of the orangutans, the toucans, the trees, the, fish, whatever, that all live in that same rainforest. The ecosystem is all the living and the non-living things. So that's the community plus all the stuff like the rocks and the dirt and just the stuff that's not alive. If we look at a biome, we've really zoomed out. So now we're just looking at everything in one kind of ecosystem. So like the deciduous forest or a tundra. Okay, that would be an example of the biome. And then we can talk about the biosphere. Now, the biosphere is just another word for the earth. The earth is a sphere, and bio means life. So it's the living sphere. If we're talking about the biosphere, we're talking about the entire planet, anywhere that there is life. Now, check out this question, because this is a pretty common question you might see on a test. It says, which of the following would be a community? All right, so it would be all the birds in one area, all the living and non-living things in an area, or all the living things in the area, or would it be just a really small group of birds? So if you need to, pause it, go back, look at this, all right? We're looking for a community, so we want all the populations in an area. So hopefully we can kind of figure this one out, all right? This would be, give you a second, probably C, right? All the populations in an area. All right, so let's move on. What is ecological succession? Wow, that's the second thing we said we were going to talk about. Well, anytime an ecosystem is disturbed, like by a fire or a cataclysm, right? An earthquake, a hurricane, maybe, human beings come in and clear cut a forest, any kind of like large scale change to an ecosystem. After that occurs, there is something called ecological succession. So it's what happens after the change. And ultimately, the change is going to result in what we call the climax community. It's the community that is best situated for that area, all right? And one of the vocab terms that we want to make sure that we can identify is this one right here. It says pioneer species. So a pioneer is like, the pioneers that went out west, they settled, the Midwest and then the far west and then, Alaska, right? Pioneers are the organisms that arrive first. So if we look at primary succession, right, this is succession that occurs in an area where there was no ecosystem. So something happened and like everything died or the majority of everything died. So this is like when a desert starts to transition from a desert to a grassland. Right? Or, if you build a dam and flood an area that was formerly, not next to water, right now it's next to water. So there can be some big changes that happen there. So primary succession is the series of changes that occur when there was no previous ecosystem. All right? Sorry about that. Secondary succession is the succession that occurs after a disaster. And you know what? I forgot something. Another great example of this is when volcanic islands form in the ocean. So you have like your volcano underneath the surface of the water. Right? So here's our, let's get a blue pen. So we have the surface of the water, and underneath the water, right? These are our waves. And underneath the water, you have, a volcano, and it's, built like erupting, and it's building up the magma or the lava rather. And then over time, it's tall enough to stick up out of the ocean, right? And, there's all this lava down here that's solidified, and you get basically like a mountaintop, so like Hawaii. There was no ecosystem before. So the establishment of an ecosystem on this island is a great example of primary succession. So anyway, secondary succession. Secondary succession occurs after a disaster. Typically, it's going to restore the original community. So you look at this picture right here, like, all right, what could have happened? Well, everything's pretty much like blown over. I'm pretty sure this is a picture of Mount St. Helens after the Mount St. Helens volcanic eruption in the, I think, 80s. But there's no reason to think that the community that was there already for years and years and years.
Ms. St. Clair, please call extension
Have an announcement.
3118. Ms. St. Clair, please call extension 3118.
Okay, anyway, there's no reason to think that the community, the ecosystem that was already in place wasn't well suited for this environment. So we expect it to return. Right? I've got a link in here for Mount St. Helens. You can kind of go watch this video. It's pretty interesting. It'll show you some before and after stuff about what happened to the ecosystem after Mount St. Helens erupted. So I encourage you to go watch that. Now let's switch gears one more time. Let's talk about that last topic of the three in our overview here that we want to look at. And that is a biome. So here is just a general map of biomes throughout the world. You can see that there are rainforests, right? There are grasslands, temperate forests, deserts, something called the tundra, the taiga, right? All these different biomes. You've probably heard of all of them before. Okay, and you can kind of see here on this map where they're laid out. There's a couple that we want to just point out a few specifics about. So the first one is the rainforest. Rainforest has a tremendous amount of rain. That's why it's called the rainforest. And they typically have really tall trees, right? One of the hallmarks of a rainforest is the fact that the diversity of species in the rainforest is much greater than anywhere else. We find a lot of the species on Earth concentrated in these rather small regions compared to the Earth's volume as a whole. Now, deserts are kind of the opposite of a rainforest, right? So a desert is going to receive less than 25 centimeters of rain a year. That's a number that we want to know, right? So this down here, this yellow brick would be our desert. And, we compare that to the rainforest. The rainforest is up here getting 90 centimeters of rain a year. The desert is underneath this cutoff right there. Now notice something. The desert and the tundra both get about the same amount of rain here in this graph. The difference is often latitude and longitude for our tundra. Tundras are typically cold. We find them near the poles, north or south, where a desert we're going to typically find around the equator. Deserts do typically get pretty hot during the day, but they also lose that heat very rapidly and they get very cold at night. Now, the next one we want to look at is the grassland. Grasslands get more rain than the desert. Right? They can support grasses, they can support scrub brush or bushes, but they can't support trees. Right? They don't get enough rain to support trees. So we can see here in this graph, the grassland is getting more than that 25 centimeter cutoff. Right? So there's the cutoff for our desert, but it's not getting nearly as much as our deciduous forest or our rainforest. Now there's an interesting kind of boundary region between grasslands and forests, and that's called a savanna. Savannas are grasslands that get just enough rain to support some small trees. And that's just one that's worth pointing out because it's a hard one to classify. You would look at the data and you're like, well, it's not really enough rain to be a forest, and we only have these small trees, but It's not a grassland because there are trees. So this is kind of in that buffer zone. It's called a savanna. Now, deciduous forest is probably the environment you're most familiar with because Virginia is in the middle of a deciduous forest. So that's the main biome we have here. You get changing weather in the seasons, right? You get enough rain to support large trees. And it's a really great place to live. Like climate wise, we have a moderate climate, right? Our winters aren't too cold, our summers aren't too hot. And this is probably the biome that you're most familiar with. And the taiga or coniferous forest, right, is another biome that is usually north of our deciduous forests, or much further south, right, further from the equator, closer to the poles. You get colder weather here, so colder winters, cooler summers. And this is typically dominated by pine forests, okay? And as you continue to get closer to the poles, you'll end up coming up to the tundra. And the tundra is really cold. It's really dry. If you look back at that graph earlier, you'll notice that a tundra and a desert get about the same amount of rain. And the one difference between a desert and a tundra is a tundra has what we call permafrost. It's a layer of frozen ground that doesn't thaw all year long. It's usually a couple inches below the surface. And so those top unfrozen layers, they have enough, kind of give in the soil for roots to take hold. You can get some grasses, you can get some scrub brush like you see here in this picture from Alaska, but they're not going to get any trees. You're not going to get anything that has to have a deep root because the permafrost, you can't grow through the permafrost. It's frozen solid. So those are our main biomes on land. We also have biomes in the water. There are freshwater biomes, which are just not the ocean, right? So these are either ponds and lakes, that's group number one, or streams and rivers, that's group number two. So ponds and lakes, right? The water is typically kind of stuck in one place, right? Depending on how big the lake is, it may move around, but the waters in Lake Michigan are Lake Michigan, right? It's all in that lake. And then we also have like streams and rivers where the water is very clearly on the move from point A to point B. Okay. This picture here is actually a canal that was dug in Chernobyl. And since the Chernobyl meltdown, beavers have built dams in these canals, which has allowed some of that area to reflood. And now the algae kind of grows on top of that fresh water and it looks really gross. Opposite of our freshwater biomes are our marine biomes, and these are biomes with salt water. And you might be thinking, well, like the oceans are all salty. Is that one big biome? Well, not really. What we do instead of looking at it in terms of like Atlantic versus the Indian Ocean or the North Sea, what we actually do is we look at the zones of how deep the water goes, and we look and see what lives there and what kind of conditions are there. So here are the zones. You have zones at the top, which typically have some light. We would expect, things like, photosynthesis to occur, algae, planktons, that kind of thing. But as we get deeper, right, we head towards the abyssal zone and then the hadopelagic zone. We're getting down to like where you have crushing water pressure. There's no light from the sun, so most of the organisms that live down there are see-through, right? They're transparent. They have a lot of bioluminescence because otherwise there is no light down there. You don't have any, you don't have any photosynthesis going on, anything like that. And so, different things in the ocean or different zones in the ocean are basically broken up by how much light they get. That's one of the ways that we do it. And then also just by a set depth. So like the epipelagic zone is down to, 200 meters. The mesopelagic down to 1,000, right? Things like that. Now, something that's interesting that we're not really going to talk a tremendous amount about, but is worth pointing out, that sometimes down here you'll have what we call black smokers. And black smokers are really interesting. They are deep ocean vents and they give off like a black smoke. And the water that comes out of these vents is very, 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 very hot, like sometimes boiling. And there are some really interesting ecosystems that are built on these black smokers or these chimneys, they're sometimes called. And they can be very, very deep. And we find crabs and shrimp and tube worms and all kinds of different stuff that live in these ecosystems. So don't think as you go deeper that there's literally nothing there. It's just that what is there has to change and adapt to that area. Now, there is a joint kind of buffer region where freshwater and saltwater mix. Those are called estuaries, right? And this is where the water from the rivers and the streams are running into the ocean, and the tides are bringing the ocean in, and so you get a mixture of salt and fresh water. So that's called an estuary. One of the most famous and important species that you'll find there are the mangroves. Mangroves are trees which can live in this salty water without, dying. For the most part, you put a tree in salty water, it's not going to make it. All right, but mangroves have a unique adaptation that allows them to live there in that water, and they're also really, really important to the ecosystem because their roots hold kind of the soil in place, so they keep the coastline in place. They are very, very strongly anchored into the ground, and so even though the water is moving constantly and hurricanes come through, for the most part, the mangrove forests protect the edge of the coast. So these are really important areas. Also, as the tide goes in, right, the water level might be up, somewhere around in this region, right through there. That would be kind of coming out of the page at you. And all these little nooks and crannies in here, right, in the roots, make for a great place for fish to spawn, for, the young juvenile species or juvenile members of each species to kind of grow up. So these are great nurseries for many species as well. So these are really important parts of the estuary ecosystem. So hopefully we can now answer these questions. What is ecology? What kind of succession occurs when there is a disaster or when there is new land that's formed? What's a biome? And we can talk about the biomes. That's what we want to get out of this video. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be glad to give you guys a hand. But other than that, I'll see you in the next video.